So today, we're diving into one of the most powerful books I think I've ever read, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And really, it's so much more than a book. It's this incredible testament to the human spirit, written by a psychiatrist who survived the absolute horror of the concentration camps. And through that experience, he uncovered a fundamental truth about what keeps us going, even when things feel completely hopeless.
Now, this might sound a little jarring, but this is the question Dr. Frankl would often ask his patients right at the start. It wasn't about shock value, though. It was a starting point. See, by getting them to talk about the reasons they chose to live, maybe it was love for their kids, a talent they still had to use, a memory they cherished, he could help them pinpoint the why that made their lives meaningful.
But you have to understand, Frankl's theory wasn't dreamed up in some comfortable office. It was forged in the fire, when he himself was stripped of absolutely everything and forced to answer that exact same question under the most brutal circumstances you can possibly imagine. His search for meaning began where everything else ended. It all started the moment he arrived at Auschwitz. The humanization was immediate, it was systematic, and it was designed to just erase every single trace of who you were before.
The very first test was what they called the finger game. A senior SS officer just stood there, casually pointing left or right. Left meant the gas chambers, right meant forced labor, a slim chance to see another day. And just like that, with a simple flick of a finger, the fate of 90% of the people on his transport was sealed.
Frankl was sent to the right, but he was no longer Dr. Viktor Frankl. He wasn't a husband or an author or a psychiatrist anymore. He was just a number. In the camp, nobody ever asked for your name. They just glanced at the number tattooed on your skin. Your entire identity, your whole history, gone. And this quote, it just perfectly captures that psychological state. After being stripped of your documents, your possessions, your wedding ring, even your hair, the prisoners were left with literally nothing but their own naked existence. And in that moment of total loss, a strange, grim sense of humor started to set in, along with this kind of cold curiosity about what would happen next. So after the initial shock of arrival started to wear off, the prisoners entered a second psychological phase. To survive the daily, hourly horrors, they had to achieve a sort of emotional death. Frankl saw this apathy not as a weakness, but as a crucial survival tool. It was a protective shell. Things like pity or disgust or horror, those were luxuries the prisoners just couldn't afford to feel. They'd watch scenes of unimaginable cruelty and feel nothing, because to feel anything would be to break completely. This quote is just chilling. Frankl tells this story about seeing a fellow prisoner having a terrible nightmare, and for a second he wanted to wake him up. But then he stopped himself, because he realized that waking him up would only bring him back to a reality that was infinitely worse than any horror his mind could cook up in his sleep. But, and this is so important, it's right here, in this absolute pit of despair and dehumanization, that Frankl makes his most incredible discovery. This is the real turning point, the core message of the entire book. So just think about that for a second. When every single external freedom is ripped away from you, when your body is starved and beaten, when your very name is gone, what is left? What can a person possibly hold on to? And here it is. This is the answer he found. They could control his body, his environment, everything around him, but they could not control his inner response. He realized that even in the face of all that suffering, he still had the ultimate freedom. The freedom to choose his own attitude, to decide how he would face it all. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, it meant retreating to a life of inner riches. Prisoners could choose to focus their minds on the image of someone they loved. They could find a moment of real beauty in a sunset over the camp. They could use humor to rise above their situation, or even find a purpose in the very way they chose to bear their suffering. Frankl talks about being on this freezing, miserable march, and he started having these vivid mental conversations with his wife. He had no idea if she was even still alive, but you know what? He realized it didn't even matter. The image of her and the love he felt was so powerful it filled him with this feeling of bliss that made the horror around him just fade away. Love was a spiritual force. And it wasn't just love. One evening, another prisoner ran into their hut and begged everyone to come outside and see the sunset. And so they stood there, watching the sky just blaze with color over the gray mud huts, and one man whispered this phrase. Right there, in the middle of hell on earth, they found a moment to appreciate beauty.
They chose to see it. So these profound personal discoveries, they didn't just stay in the camp with him. They became the actual foundation for the school of psychotherapy he would go on to create. He called it logotherapy. It comes from the Greek word logos, which means meaning. Now, unlike Freud, who was all about the will to pleasure, or Adler, who focused on the will to power, Frankl argued that our most fundamental human drive is our will to meaning. Frankl often used this quote from the philosopher Nietzsche to really nail down the idea. In the camps, he saw it proven over and over again. The prisoners who had a reason to survive, a child waiting for them, a book they felt they had to write, those were the ones most likely to endure the horrific how of their existence. Okay, so what does all this mean for us? Living our lives in a world with so much relative comfort and freedom? Well, Frankl's lessons aren't just about surviving something extreme. They're about how to live a truly meaningful life, right here, right now. This is such a powerful idea. Frankl says that if you chase happiness or success directly, you're always going to miss. Instead, he says they ensue. They just happen as a side effect of dedicating yourself to a cause that's bigger than you are. So in that way, meaning isn't something you go out and find. It's something you create by what you do. And that brings us right back to the beginning. But this time, the question is for you. Viktor Frankl found his why in the darkest place imaginable. The challenge for the rest of us is to find ours in the light. So what is the purpose that pulls you forward? What gives your life meaning?